Hello, everyone. I am just um er, hmm, I'm just running this to make sure that the mic is on and also that YouTube will not take me down because of copyright, which it tends to do sometimes. I don't know why this is so hazy. I wonder if there's a way to fix that because I don't like how hazy it is. Um let's see. I believe. Oh, we have. So, um, let me just get it started. Let me know if you can hear me. All right. I'm actually going. No, this is fine. We can deal with this. All right. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to the discussion for Down with Love, with the film strip, which is me. I'm Lena. Hi. Um, and I know that this movie is slightly controversial in the way that it's not everyone's cup of tea. I understand why. I personally really enjoy it, although I do think there are a couple of moments where it gets in its own way. It sort of goes all out for the camp, and sometimes it's misjudged, but sometimes I think it's just right on. So we can definitely talk about the themes of the movie. I think there are a lot of interesting things that this movie tries to do. I am not always sure how successful it is at it, but that it's bringing these things up, and we get to have this discussion about. I think it really does a good job shedding a light on the battle of the sexes more than a lot of movies of the time that it's spoofing. I find that a lot of movies with Doris Day or Rock Hudson, those types of rom-coms, they claim to sort of be battle of the sexes. Honestly, I'm not talking from a place of like great knowledge. I've only seen a couple of them. Um, but I find that um, they sort of promote themselves as these like sort of fun battle of the sexes types of movies, but they never actually address anything about the relationships between men and women and like feminism and the sort of things that are expected from each gender. Um, I think you could maybe look at Where the Boys Are, which is it's a very different kind of movie, but it does sort of get into what those relationships are like. But it's also a bummer. It's very much that's also a movie that's very much of its time. So if you do watch it, be prepared for a lot of late 50s, early 60s uh, punishing of women in general. But I also think it's a pretty accurate depiction of what dating was, the expectations of dating and what it was like at that time. Um, in a sort of like modern feminist way, in the way that the women are meant to be sort of knowing and cynical and sort of not as in it, like they're willing to talk about sex in a way that it was previously seen as like unwomanly to do. Um, so in terms of Down with Love, I think there's a lot that we could talk about with regards to equality and what the movie kind of terms as equality. Uh, in general, it sort of seems like by the end of the movie, both characters get everything they want. Barbara Novak gets to keep her job and get the man. Like they're sort of like a modern couple. Ooh, interesting. Interesting. Can you hear me? I think I got it. Okay. Um, Apologies about that. Uh, so in the way that Barbara Novak gets everything that she wants, which includes a successful career, the man of her dreams, he's supportive of her, and they're both going to be working people as a family. So she sort of gets love and career, and that is sort of like the ultimate goal of what women want. And I think it's perpetuating this idea of women having it all in a way that doesn't really extend to, I guess, um, it doesn't really extend to how having it all is not necessarily can be really destructive, because then like the idea of women having a career and a family and marriage, you have to do the labor of both, because originally having a family, running a household, doing all those things, it was a job in itself, and women being um expected to do that and being forced to do that and not being able to have a career if they wanted to, that was all horrible. But the labor, it was unpaid labor, unpaid emotional labor as well. So it was all this unpaid labor of running the household. And now there's sort of this expectation that a woman has to be a mother and the CEO and um has to run a successful company. And so now women are expected to have two full-time jobs that are incredibly frustrating. And if they ask a man for help, then they're not being independent, they're not being feminist. um, and so I think that is probably one of that's one of the things that occurred to me at the end of the film, just like the idea of Barbara getting what she wanted in the context of modern romances, but not necessarily that's not necessarily the better thing for women. It is. I do think the movie is a feminist movie. But I do think it's limited in some ways uh, by what might be considered feminine, by what might be considered feminism, or the expectations of what is a happy ending for a woman. Um, I also I wish the movie had gone a little bit more into Catch's conversion from womanizer to wanting a house in the suburbs, I guess. Um, I think that it's also at any time, feel free to chime in, send me a text, ask me a question, comment, or whatever. Um, and I'll try to like integrate that. I don't want to just like be talking for half an hour, although I can and I will, because it's me. Um, I do think that it's what was I gonna say? I wish it had shown more of his progression, because I think the idea of men. So I liked the idea of Catcher's friend sort of taking on like the not the female role, but like the aspects of like what people consider. So their best. let me resituate this. So their best friends, Barbara's best friend, sort of exemplified the actual down with love girl. She was very much into no strings attached, all business, did not like wanted love, but it was more of like in the way that a lot of people want companionship. And then Catch's best friend, I can only think of them by their actors' names, but it's David Hyde Pierce, seemed to fit into more of like the neurotic. He wants romance. He's nervous. Like he's like the feminine one, which is like why she thinks he's gay or something, which didn't really ring true with me, but okay. Um, but it was interesting how they sort of embodied these characters that the main characters were pretending to be. Um, and it was interesting to me that they included a man who wanted romance as much as women are supposed to want romance. Um, but they also, I feel like, kind of made fun of him too much a little bit, and that they that Catch's conversion to wanting like the suburbs, it either rang a little false, or they wanted they didn't explore it enough. Um like, I wish it was something like, oh, men want love just as much as women do. And like, men want family as well. And they never really explicitly said that, although they kind of edged toward that. They didn't really explicitly say any like they didn't have any character say like explicitly. They skirted around the edges a lot. So one comment is it seemed to mock feminism, not celebrate feminism. I'm not sure that it was necessarily mocking it. I think it's easily confused because it was mocking the tropes of the era. So it was definitely mocking the sort of outsized um, notions of romance. It was sort of it mocked Catch, I think, just as much as it mocked Barbara. So it was sort of mocking the entire I don't know, jet set crowd of um the conventions that they lived by, or like how the way that they were portrayed in movies is so unrealistic. um so if you look at sort of those movies of like you know, just people, if I think it's a movie that looks a lot at other movies of the time, which is kind of why I chose it. So it was, I think, mocking those tropes, but I don't know that they were necessarily mocking the feminist themselves. Um, uh, a woman couldn't have love and be businesslike. I think that's sort of true. Although it sort of implies that love isn't businesslike for anyone. I don't know that any of the characters in the movie were businesslike at all. I don't think that Catch's friend could really be businesslike. He was sort of overcome with his neuroses. Um, I do think that division of having of saying, oh well, when women throw away love, then they can focus on business. The assumption that women are so preoccupied with love um, isn't it's kind of false. um, I do think that it's um, maybe the conceit of it's hard for me to define what exactly the revolution of Down with Love is, like the book itself. It is kind of trying to separate women. So I think there's this whole idea of the secretary um is there's this whole idea that that secretaries are only around to like fall in love with their bosses. Um I think the movie is coming into this world where they have I'm trying to think of specific examples. I do think that when uh I'm in a corner now. um the let's see. So okay. I it's there's this idea that um I think the chocolate, they say that the chocolate is sort of to replace these ideas of like what love is. Um that women eat chocolate instead of looking for attention from a man. Um, and it's I think a lot of it is coming from this place where women are trained to think that way, because it's set in a time when women have sort of been trained to think that way. Not necessarily that women did, but in like the early 60s, um, it was this common perception, that that's it was this common perception of women. I think the movie deals a lot in perceptions and what we think of the time. So it's not necessarily what was actual at that time. It's not necessarily the way that people were living their lives in the 60s, but it's this idea of the kind of world that was being promoted in the movies of that era. And so that kind of world, women were um women did sort of weren't able to be professional because they were falling in love all the time. And that's not a feminist take, but that's a lot of what happens in those movies. Which is one of the reasons why I don't really like those movies. But I think that it's taking it from that point of view. It's like, what if we introduced modern feminism into a Doris Day movie, and what would that look like? And how would that affect the characters? If at the Since at the end it kind of turned into one of those movies, in the sense that, like, she was his secretary, she did fall in love with him. um it's sort of playing as an homage. So I think part of the reason it's so controversial is because it both loves those movies and also understands the contradictions of those movies. I think that the thanks, mom and dad. um I do think that uh the thing I was gonna say was, it's it's taking place in the world of those movies and not necessarily in the modern world. So in the world of those movies, um, women can't have business and love at the same time, except at the very end, it kind of goes away from that idea, and and they do have business and love at the same time, and the best friends get together, and neither of them gives up their careers. So I think it sort of proves its own, like, it sort of changes the narrative a little bit, but it does begin with the narrative, with that sort of narrative. And also the stewardess sort of comes in, and shows that you can have both, or that you can choose one and not the other, that you can choose your career. Um, so it's complex, I think. And it's also, if you're not familiar with those movies and it kind of comes out of left field, it's not going to be very much fun. Uh, so, um, one commenter asks, "How is this a good movie? It seems silly and over the top." I do agree that it's a little bit over the top. There are some points where I wish they had played the joke a little bit more. I don't want to say flat, but I wish they had undersold the joke a little bit more. Um, I loved the costumes in the 60s nostalgia. That's like my era for me. And it was also a great soundtrack. I loved the set design. I thought that the characters were like really engaging and fun. One of the reasons I like this movie is the way that it plays with language. I know it can get tiresome for some people, but just the whole, like, a lot of the conversations around, um the No and Now magazine. I just think a lot of the script got a lot of clever stuff in, and it sort of felt like a fun romp from time to time. Um, I also think that it's an interesting look at how the different um there are a couple of things in the movie that I did sort of like. It's an interesting look at how the different genders are portrayed, especially in the sequence with Fly Me to the Moon, where it's Julie London and Frank Sinatra. And so Sinatra has like all the swag, it's very masculine. And then like you shift over to Bossa Nova and it's all bubbles and light and like pink satin and or pink sheer chiffon or whatever it is. And it's the same core, right? It's the same song, but the way that it's shifted, it is like signaling gender in some way, which I think is really fun. And I mean, I like both songs and I like both those characters. And so sort of assigning one thing to one person kind of shows up how arbitrary it is in some way. Um, uh, and I think, though, like it is a bit campy and not everyone is into camp. I understand that. I'm very much into camp. And I think part of the reason I like camp so much is because it's so artificial. It's showing how it's looking at the artifice and saying that's artifice. So it's looking at the way that we consider gender, the way that we consider relationships, and sex, and it's looking at it's saying, well, if we portray this the way that if we turn it up to 11, if we take these concepts that people keep spouting and people keep talking about as fact and we turn it up to 11, then we're showing everyone how constructed it really is, because usually those things are more insidious. They're when they're more muted, they seem more normalized. And so by making it not normalized, by making it weird and like funky, it's saying, well, I just took the thing that you said was right, or I just took like this concept and brought it to its logical conclusion, and now you're saying it's weird. So it's looking at how constructed a lot of society is. And if there's and this movie is extremely constructed. This movie very much focuses on the efforts that we go into for social relationships. It looks at the way that we play games with each other. It's very much in the sense, um, uh, very much in the sense that it couldn't. What was I going to say? Uh, 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 I completely lost my train of thought. I'm doing great. But yeah, that was the idea. That's one of the reasons I like camp, and I think that's one of the reasons that this movie is entertaining. I have a different like people don't have to like this movie, right? Like I think it's fun. I hadn't seen it in a while, so I maybe liked it a little bit less this time than I did before, but I still think that there's a lot of good stuff in there. I think that it's still an entertaining, fun movie. And there's a lot to talk about. So it couldn't decide whether it was a satire or a celebration, which is actually something I agree with. I do think that they could have delineated a little bit more. I enjoyed the spoof aspects of it, but it was hard. It was hard for me to come down on where they stood in regards to certain things, like with feminism, like with the workplace, with their relationship, because it kept going back and forth between, oh, this is like a pastiche, like, don't you love these movies? It's all nostalgia. There's a lot of things going on. Like, we're gonna make fun of the beatniks now, and he's like they were having a lot of fun with like his playboy-ness, and like it was like the sex farce and everything. And then sometimes it would because it would try to critique those things too. And because they were having so much fun with those characters, you sort of you couldn't decide whether they were being either um uh if they were supposed to be people that you like looked up to, or so there's a certain level of liking the character, or like having the character be the hero instead of the character being the center of satire, because you can like a character even though they're a satirical character, because they just seem very real and it's very uncomfortable, and it's just like, oh, you're so like, you're such a person, and like I can understand the mistakes that you're making and stuff like that. It's very different to like promote that person as a hero. And so they couldn't really decide whether these people were heroes or not. They were sort of trying to have it both ways, that they were both people that like you can sort of aspire to be, but also that they had these flaws and shortcomings, and they never really got into what those flaws and shortcomings were. So I would actually agree with that it wasn't quite certain, and that's what sort of makes this movie like not as perfectly good as the other movies. I think that's one of the major flaws of the movie, is that it can't really it it's a pastiche with a little bit of bite, but it doesn't really leave a lot to chew on, I guess. But I still like the movie, and you can't account for taste. I think that, that is one of the things that I sort of brought up with in my 5-minute video of where, what is it specifically satirizing, and like where is that satire supposed to land, especially in comparison with Singing in the Rain, where the satire is supposed to the satire is mainly on Hollywood, and the way the Singing in the Rain is so weird because because it is sort of a satire of the way that Hollywood moved from silence to talkies, um, but it's not a satire. I don't want to say the word satirizing anymore, because I'm not like, every time I say it, it sounds like I'm not saying it correctly. But it's a satire. It's not being a satire of the relationship between Don and Kathy, that is played completely straight. And so, um, but it's interesting to see what the 50s considered like satire worthy, in a sense, and what we're considering satire worthy now, because we're looking directly at the relationship, and we're trying to and it's trying to be a satire, and which one works better. We have a lot of spoofs and satires now, and I'm wondering if satires of romantic comedies don't really work, because it's hard to not take the characters seriously, but to make the point that you want to make. I think a lot of romantic comedies actually make really legitimate points sometimes in regards to the way that we treat women, the way that people are seen perceived to be your equal. A lot of this movie is about finding your equal, and I find that a lot of rom-coms in general is about finding your equal, finding your partner. You can definitely say that Cary Grant and Irene Dunne in The Awful Truth, they were absolutely equals, even if they were equals in their depravity. You can say that everyone in Design for Living is equal. So a lot of these movies are about finding your equal, and the job of the movie is to define what finding your equal means, and how that equality is matched. Um, and sometimes it doesn't do that well because feminism gets in the way. Doris Day can't find her equal because, oh, I haven't seen Shampoo, so I can't comment on that, and I really want to see it because Warren Beatty's in it. But I think I know that Shampoo sort of did a lot of work. It sort of revolutionized romantic comedies in a certain way, because they talked about things that you weren't necessarily supposed to talk about at that time. Um, but it's it kind of got in the way of like the Doris Day movies, because she wasn't being portrayed really as a rounded person. She was just looking for love. And I think that is what makes some romantic comedies really hard for people, is like when the woman only wants love, doesn't really it's hard to find an equal for a person that doesn't feel like a person. um but I do think that looking at the way that um Dawn and Kathy behave as equals, and the way that their relationship is portrayed, makes makes it feel more like a romantic comedy sometimes, than maybe Down with Love does, even though it's by far hits way more of the down way more of like the romantic comedy checklist. Um, so that's why I paired those movies together. That's why this week is mid-century and satire, is because I think those movies, in comparison, because they're both satires, but they're looking at completely different things. But they both also, one is like from the mid-century, and so we can look at what makes a mid-century satire, what they thought audiences at the time, or like what they sort of believed was worthy of not introspection, but sort of um, shaking it up a bit, like social discord, I guess. And then looking at the mid-century. Looking at the satire of the mid-century and what that focuses on, because they're actually completely two different focuses, and I find that really interesting. Um, so I know that people have various thoughts about Down with Love. Maybe it wasn't everyone's favorite movie. That's totally okay. Can't Buy Me Love is next. I know that's some people's favorite movie. It is. We are getting into our week on teenage movies, which is really great. It was really hard to pare down this list to 2 weeks. Because I'm doing weekly now. It was really hard to pare this down to 2 weeks. I might do like a little bit of an extension at the end if I come up with more movies, because apparently 1999 was like the best movie, the best year ever for teen movies. But we're starting with the 80s. We're not doing John Hughes. We are going to talk a little bit about John Hughes because that's inevitable. But we're not doing a John Hughes movie. We're actually doing Can't Buy Me Love with Patrick Dempsey. And it's actually I think it's a really fun, sort of heartfelt movie with an extremely typical teenage plot. It's like the most by the numbers idea of what a teen rom-com is, but I think because it's one of the first to do it, it's actually a really good example and really fun and innovative, and it doesn't seem tired because like it hadn't really been done before. So that is what's coming up. Thank you for joining me for this discussion of Down with Love. I appreciated all your feedback and all your comments. Please leave more. I'm really excited to do it, and I will see you next Wednesday. We're going back to Wednesday. Today was like this week was a little bit of up in the air, so I appreciate you being flexible. But it will be next Wednesday, and I will see you then. As always, I have the syllabus and the Venmo in the links if you want to support me. And I look forward to next time. All right.